We do this because everything else has failed.
The Catonsville Nine changed the way many Americans thought about the Vietnam War. Conflict had been building in Vietnam due to the clash of colonialism, nationalism, and communism. The French were colonizing Vietnam and the countries around it, also known as Indochina. Within the country, the Vietnamese began to want freedom, which led to a buildup of nationalism. Inside the other belief of equality emerged strong communism.
The North Vietnamese had a stronger belief in communism. Ho Chi Minh became their leader.
He went to the countries in the Allied forces and found no help.
The Vietnamese were now at war with France against colonialism. Ho Chi Minh said,
"You can kill every 10 of my men for every 1 I kill of yours, but even at those odds, you will lose and I will win."
The Vietnamese, now known as the Viet Minh, did win the war. Diplomats in Geneva, Switzerland, decided that the Vietnam would be split into North and South along with the 17th parallel.
The U.S. government believed that communism would spread if they were not careful.
They called this the domino effect of communism.
The U.S. convinced South Vietnam that communism was not the way to go.
And so it was. The U.S. became involved in the war by fighting the North Vietnamese so that communism wouldn't spread.
Anti-war activist movements began to show up. Here's a song from one of the movements.
Well, come on, all of you big strong men. Uncle Sam needs your help again. Got himself in a terrible jam way down yonder in Vietnam. Put down your books and pick up a gun. We're gonna have a whole lot of fun. And it's...
Even though anti-war movements have started, there were still many people supporting the war, especially the U.S. government.
The Catonsville Nine was a group of 9 people who were just ordinary citizens.
Mary Moylan was a member of the Catonsville Nine. She was a registered nurse and a certified midwife. She was an old friend of George Mish, also a Catonsville Nine member. During the incident, she held her hand on the phone to prevent calling for help. George Mish was a peace activist and a U.S. Army veteran. He went to a government college. Before the Catonsville Nine, he lived with his fellow Catonsville Nine members. Tom Lewis was an artist and a peace activist. He was in the Catonsville Nine and the Baltimore Four. Before the event, he went to the Knights of Columbus building, saying he wanted to have his wedding reception there. He was 28 at the time of the incident. David Darst was a teacher, a peace activist, and a writer. He volunteered for the Catonsville Nine after hearing about the Baltimore Four. Marjorie Melville was born in Mexico but raised by American parents. She entered Maryknoll in 1949 and was sent to Guatemala in 1954. She was forced to leave Maryknoll in 1967 for involvement in internal politics in Guatemala. She then married Thomas Melville in 1968, and they went to the U.S. in 1968 as well. Marjorie Melville then joined the Catonsville Nine for the same reasons as Tom, and then had to draw parallels between the U.S. involvement in Latin America and Southeast Asia. Her job in the Catonsville Nine action was to make sure that the clerks did not call the police before the others could get all the draft records. These two the Barringer brothers. Philip Barringer served in World War II and then joined the Josephites. He spoke out against militarism in the Cold War of the 60s because it disturbed him so much. And Daniel Barringer was a Jesuit priest, teacher, and poet, and an activist, of course. He traveled to North Vietnam with Dr. H. Zinn to help 3 U.S. soldiers get home safely. He was influenced by Dorothy Day, the pacifist of the Cold War worker movement. John Hogan was 33 years old at the time of the Catonsville Nine action. He became a Maryknoll brother in 1953 and then was assigned to Guatemala. He then left Maryknoll in the Maryknoll Order in 1968 because of conflicting views on revolution.
Thomas Melville was born in 1929. He was ordained as a Maryknoll priest and sent to Guatemala in 1957. Then he was exiled from Guatemala for trying to create an opposition in the government. He then joined the Catonsville Nine because of his good friend George Mish. This is the building where the Catonsville Nine action happened. The building is right in the center of Catonsville, Maryland, just outside of Baltimore, at 2021 Frederick Road. Today, this same building is the home of the Knights of Columbus and a dance school. There are no plaques or signs indicating that this building played a part in American history. The Catonsville Nine was the offspring of the Baltimore Four. Philip Barringer and Tom Lewis had previously poured blood on draft records at the Baltimore Custom House in order to bring attention to the anti-war movement. Barringer stated in a written statement, "This sacrificial and constructive act is meant to protest the pitiful waste of American and Vietnamese blood in Indochina." It was 1968, after his release on bail, Barringer decided to have another attempt. The Catonsville Nine was born. On May 17, 1968, the Barringer brothers, Mr. David Darst, Mr. George Mish, Mr. Tom Lewis, Mr. John Hogan, Mr. Thomas Melville, Miss Marjorie Melville, and Mrs. Mary Moylan, entered the Knights of Columbus building.
They then rushed past 3 very shocked clerks, then stole over several hundred draft records of young men going over to Vietnam and placed them in wire baskets. They then put napalm on the paper to ignite the fire. The Catonsville Nine were tried in federal court. They were found guilty of destruction of U.S. property, destruction of selective service files, and interference with the Selective Service Act of 1967. They were sentenced to 18 years of jail and a fine of $22,000. When it came time to show up for prison, many of the Catonsville Nine went underground and made it very difficult to find them, causing a great embarrassment for the FBI Director, J. Edgar Hoover. There was a lot of protesting in Baltimore during the trial. Also, there was national attention because it was so close to the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
Because the Catonsville Nine consisted of adults, professionals, and other authority figures, it was hard to dismiss this as just more than students and hippies causing trouble. The Catonsville Nine inspired many other anti-draft and anti-military actions in the 1960s and the 1970s. Including the DC 9, the Chicago 8, the Harrisburg 7, and the Camden 28. Members of the Catonsville Nine stayed active in peace movements. With no active war to protect, the movement moved its focus onto nuclear weapons. Barringer, after being excommunicated for secretly marrying a nun, formed the Jonah House in West Baltimore. This was a community committed to nonviolent resistance. The members of this community became the Plowshare Movement. This movement is still active in American history, despite the passing of the Catonsville Nine members. The Catonsville Nine was a turning point in the Vietnam anti-war movement because it drew attention to the war through a dramatic display carried out by Catholic activists, which sparked more protests among American people, especially youth, against the war.